Yeah, so Dr. Shameen, a very good afternoon. Maybe may I request you to switch on your video camera? So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Youtalks. My name is Mukesh Sharma, and I have a very, very special guest today with us, Dr. Shameen Prashantham. Shameen Prashantham is Professor of International Business and Strategy and Associate Dean of the MBA program at the China Europe International Business School, CEIBS in Shanghai. And his research focuses on what he calls dancing with gorillas and how startups and large multinational corporations partner with each other. So Dr. Shameen Prashantham, very, very warm welcome to you on Youtalks. And it has been my privilege to have spoken to you in the last couple of months about your book. And, we are very, very honored to have you today.
Thank you so much, Mukesh. It's a real pleasure for me to be on this show.
So, Dr. Shameen, I'm sure that you have been very busy, not only in your, educational assignments, dealing with the professional students from all the categories and ages. You just told me before we logged into the program that you are still in the, campus and, doing your executive MBA program teachings. So thanks a lot finding, time on this Sunday afternoon amidst your schedule. I know you have a hard stop. Generally when people come onto the Youtalk show, they are generally having a good time in break and they come on, but you have only 50 minutes. So we'll try to see how much we can extract the knowledge, the wisdom from your, discussions today. So straightforward going into this, what was the inspiration for Gorillas Can Dance?
So basically, over 15 years ago, I graduated with my PhD in Scotland, and my topic was about how small entrepreneurial companies can go international. So I was in an international business unit led by two very well-known scholars in Europe at the time, Neil Hood and Stephen Young. And they had for many years been studying about large multinational companies, because many American multinationals in particular, when they started internationalizing into Europe, after Europe recovered, thanks to the Marshall Plan after World War II, many of them established their manufacturing for these facilities in Scotland. Their commercial offices down in London, and UK was seen as a beachhead to go into Europe. So there was a lot of expertise in this research center about large companies. Then from the 1990s, there was this late 90s onwards, a wave of doctoral students came in who started looking at these smaller entrepreneurial companies. And in fact, my research was about how small Indian software ventures were going international. And I was looking at how they tapped into the diaspora networks and non-diaspora ties, how they internationalized. And then when I finished, in fact, in my PhD itself, I began to see one or two examples of a Bangalore startup that was trying to work with Motorola and Bangalore, try to internationalize. And then in Scotland, I saw one or two examples. So I thought, began to question, why are we studying the big companies separately and these smaller companies separately? Is it not possible to start working together? And then I posed this question to C.K. Prahalad at a conference shortly after I graduated. And he said, in my opinion, these smaller companies have no choice. They need to learn to dance with the big gorilla. So I latched onto that phrase, dancing with gorillas, and then began to start researching. And that's how I got into this.
Fantastic, fantastic. So now my next question for the viewers is that, why these gorillas, the big corporations are still finding it as big challenge to dance with them?
So first of all, things have evolved dramatically over a period of time. So I wrote my first sort of major article in 2008. It was titled Dancing with Gorillas. I co-authored with a professor in London Business School called Julian Birkinshaw and published it at California Management Review. Back then, all the examples we had, they were almost happy accidents. Some very entrepreneurial entrepreneur who had the guts to go and talk to some big company. And in some cases, because the founder used to work for the big company before, they had some links, or there was some very entrepreneurial manager in the big company who found that it was useful to engage with startups. And over a decade and a half, actually many large companies have established more systematic ways to engage with startups. But nevertheless, as you said, it's still not straightforward. And I refer to this as the paradox of asymmetry. So basically, the reason why these two sets of firms even consider working together is because they have complementarities. The former chief design officer of Coca-Cola put it very succinctly. He said, companies like ours, we have scale. We want to engage with startups that have agility. So on paper, they're these big differences are very complementary. But what I have observed in reality is that the very differences that make it attractive to work together also makes it challenging. Right? And that's the paradox of asymmetry. And so that therein lies the big challenge. They are so vastly different that while on paper they can work together, in reality it becomes challenging.
Right. But have you seen that, of course, the startup ecosystem has been evolving, and I would say that now accelerating a lot, whether you look at in US or China or India and, even Israel, and there are many hubs like that. While the challenges has been there, but what distinctly you find maybe one or two things which have become, let's say, easier as compared in last decade to this decade, and probably what may happen in the next decade? Is anything you find it changing?
So first of all, I think many companies have tried to do this, and in that process, they have figured out certain things. And I think actually, you mentioned various ecosystems that I've been lucky enough to do, and I've been lucky enough to do research in all of them. So I've seen, I've been able to compare different locations, and I've seen changes over time. What I find common to all the companies that seem to be doing it well is consciously or unconsciously, they have unpacked these differences that exist, the asymmetries, and found ways to address them. They have, for example, recognized that there is a asymmetry of goals. The two organizations are aiming for slightly different things and at very different time frames. They have an asymmetry of structure. It's very difficult to find role counterparts. As a company leader in a big company, you're like the China CEO, you will easily find another China CEO of another multinational who will be happy to talk to you. But for smaller entrepreneurial firms that have much flatter structures, it's much more difficult to find the right person to talk to. And then thirdly, there's what I call the asymmetry of attention, which is that for each party, they don't know how to prioritize them relatively limited managerial attention. The big company sees thousands of startups out there, and then but they don't know which ones to take seriously. The startups know who the big corporations are, but they don't know who within the corporation to attract the attention of. And so one of the things that has changed, and this is one of the things I try to document in my book, is there seems to be ways in which each of these asymmetries can be overcome. So for the first asymmetry of goals, it is about clarifying the synergy. And I talk about two broad synergies. The technology companies tend to focus on building block synergies. So the startup builds on top of it, and the win-win is co-selling. Whereas for more traditional companies, say a BMW, it's about pain point synergies. We realize that our business model has to change, but we have challenges around cybersecurity. We bring in startups to address that. And so there the startup sells to the large company. And that may sound blindingly obvious, but without making it absolutely clear at the start, the lack of clarity can be confusing and problematic and waste a lot of time for both parties. Secondly, to address the asymmetry of structure, creating interfaces makes a difference. And this is the big thing that has changed over time compared to my 2008 article. Now, in many companies, you can find an entity. In BMW, it's called BMW Startup Garage. In Microsoft, it's called Microsoft for Startups. And you have people who have KPIs to engage with these startups, and the startups at least have an initial port of call. And the third thing is cultivating exemplars or success stories in a very intentional fashion, because when that happens, the big company can attract other high quality startups to the partnering program. But I find even more importantly, it can help to persuade skeptical internal audiences. So the people in
Right.
the interface, if you're a manager in BMW Startup Garage, it's part of your job to talk to startups. But they can only
Right.
deliver a meaningful opportunity for the startup to engage with BMW if the BMW cybersecurity team is willing to engage with them, or some other business unit. And the business unit
Right.
managers are not incentivized to engage with startups per se. They're incentivized to do their job. And they may be a bit more
Right.
risk averse. But when they see success
Mhm.
stories, they're able to
Right.
engage with startups. So I would say over time, there
Mhm.
has been this learning effect that has
Right.
resulted from basically learning by doing. A couple of other things that have changed also over time is a sense of urgency. I think big companies have
Right.
recognized,
Mhm.
because of the disruption of digitalization and so on, they need to act, and they need
Right.
to act fast. So they become more and more humble in a way, more ecosystem minded. And I think the startups have
Mhm.
become more sophisticated too. I think the rise of cloud
Right.
computing has made it more possible
Mhm.
now for startups to have lowered the costs of startups in terms of their startup costs. And of course, many of them are now
Right.
much more savvy about thinking in advance about how they can add value to big companies.
Right. Fantastic. So I think this is really, amazing to see that how the new technologies is able to get more respect for the startups as well. And that's quite evident that, people are recognizing that. But Dr. Shameen, you always, and you know that probably, and you will also endorse that, always in a technological growth, or the way the innovation comes, or the technologies grow over the period of time, or economies grow, there are people or the corporations who are in the core or in the arena, and there's some who are sitting in the fence, or maybe the laggards. So what is your observation about a lot of companies, or when I say companies, maybe a lot of leadership as well, leaders not recognizing the importance of startups, or not still playing this game as they should? So what is your advice to those laggards?
Very well put. So in a way, my book is a study of the early adopters to
Hmm.
distill lessons for the laggards and to save them
Right.
the time and effort that these early adopters put in, because they were learning by doing in many cases. So the
Right.
important thing is to first of all understand why it makes sense to do this. And the
Right.
why has to do with the need to deal with disruptive changes. Now,
Right.
we don't want to overstate the dangers of disruption, because
Hmm.
even after there are so many disruptive forces, a lot of big companies are still around. But at the same
Right.
time, it also is the case that if you stand still, you make
Hmm.
life very difficult for yourself. And adapting to the new realities is very important. So that's at a
Right.
broad level. There's a need to be entrepreneurial. I think
Hmm.
that's the starting point. In a world
Right.
where the environment is changing, it's important to be entrepreneurial. I think it's always been the case. But
Right. Right.
people talk about this world, our current era, as being even more dynamic and complex. And so it becomes all the more
Mhm.
important. So that's a starting point. And another broad concept, I think, is the importance of an ecosystem mindset. So the idea that you
Right.
don't have to do everything yourself. So
Mhm.
there's a professor at Dartmouth, Ron Abner, who's been talking about the ecosystem mindset, and that now companies
Mhm.
should not be only thinking about competitive advantage of the firm, but the competitive advantage of the
Right.
ecosystem. And also Henry Chesbrough at Berkeley has been talking about for well over a decade about open innovation.
Mhm.
The traditional closed innovation approach is not the only game in town. And in fact, it would be advantageous for companies to think about engaging with others outside of the boundaries. So these foundational
Right.
ideas, the need to be more entrepreneurial, the importance of ecosystem thinking, the importance of open innovation, I think these companies need to recognize anyway. What
Mhm.
I'm then
Mhm.
saying is one tool, you could even think of it as an open innovation tool, is to
Right.
engage with startups. And basically, what you have on offer is an opportunity
Mm.
to tap into external startups that are exploring new possibilities that may be
Right.
complementary to the capabilities that companies have as they exploit their existing advantages. And so there is
Right.
this idea that there may be a division of entrepreneurial labor that can lead to a win-win. So the first thing is to recognize the why. It makes sense
Right.
to explore this. But then you have the challenge of the how, and the comments I made earlier about thinking about clarifying the synergy, creating interfaces, and cultivating exemplars becomes important. And that's a pattern I just have observed so consistently across companies that I think it's a very useful way to think about it. And then when you, if you're really serious about this for these laggards, what they need to do is to then over time build a new partnering capability, which is focused on partnering with these highly dissimilar companies. And that's a process that takes time. You know, you figure out this process of synergy, interface, and exemplar, but then you need to repeat, refine, and then institutionalize it within the company. I'll just say one other thing. I started by saying the starting point is the need to be entrepreneurial. And we have seen time and again over the years that often the entrepreneurial spark within a large company can happen in a bottom-up fashion. So to get started, you know, a courageous middle manager might also be able to do something relatively small. When Microsoft developed its corporate accelerator program, it's because some managers in Microsoft Israel were very intrapreneurial in developing this format, and then it was scaled on a global basis. And so I think that's also important in the laggard companies. It's not only the CEOs who need to get the message, even middle managers who can see the benefit of this should not hesitate to make attempts to get this going.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I think, Dr. Shameen, my next curiosity, you know, which is coming, the question is that now I see that, you know, when we operate in this whole ecosystem, there is an industry. Of course, we are part of the industry. Different industries are there. Then you have academics. Academics could be of management, could be of technology. Then you have the government, right? So now I sometimes wonder when I observe that Bangalore could have a flourishing ecosystem of startups, California, Hong Kong could be in somewhere, Beijing, Shanghai, Israel, UK, and you know some are probably far behind. So I was just wondering that, especially for laggards, right? Because if you really want to have a mass innovation to happen, you don't want it to be just focused in one area. You want it to be. So what, you know, laggard regions or laggard countries can learn, and who will play the most important role? Or how does that happen? I mean, if we want to pick up a case study of a region where the innovation or ecosystem of startup is less, let's say in tier 2, tier 3 cities of India, then who will play the important role? Who will give the impetus? Industry, government, academics, how it will happen?
That's a great question. So I'll answer this in two parts. The first is I just want to expand a little bit on this developing a startup partnering capability. Okay, and I think the starting point there is someone needs to start it somewhere. That's the most important thing. And I've seen examples of how Microsoft, which is headquartered in the US, had a bottom-up approach happening out of Israel. But I've also seen the Nissan group having something that started out in Hong Kong, which is where they're specifically for their luxury car brand, Infinity, because Infinity was partnered over there. A company like Swiss Re, which is a Zurich-based reinsurance company, their first insure-tech accelerator happened out of Bangalore. So it could be headquarters-driven. It could be a little bit further afield. In fact, when Coca-Cola started working with startups, they deliberately did their pilot project in Australia. So that was a decision driven by headquarters, but they chose not to do it in headquarters because they didn't want it to be stifled. So they wanted to be sufficiently far away, but in a market that was not completely insignificant. So it was small enough and far enough not to be interfered with, but big enough and with a sufficient talent pool to make sense. So there are different ways you can start. I think, as Simon Sinek says, think big, start small, but start. So the
Start.
talk to action ratio in the beginning needs to be managed so that there is something that happens. But then
Right.
these initiated projects will die out, and these sparks won't build up into a fire unless the next
Right.
step happens from initiation to expansion. So from the initiation part, you can even be under the radar, be very entrepreneurial, and then do something. But then that won't take off unless then there's buy-in from senior leadership. And that's where being politically savvy in terms of intra-company politics becomes important. In fact, the more I've studied this, the more I've come to the view that for managers who want to engage with startups, dealing with the external startups, though challenging, is relatively easier than dealing with the internal politics where they have to pursue it. So in the book, I talk about this idea of boundary spanning. And this is a capability that managers need to have. You don't necessarily learn it in MBA school. This is more about the social intelligence side of things, which I feel someone like you exemplifies very well. You build networks so well within the company, outside the company. And that's what's important, to be able to then gain influence. And you have to manage up. You have to get internal champions from the leaders. You need to have opportunity generators from your peers. If you're a middle manager, the people in the business units who'll be willing to talk to startups. And you need to have this broader coalition of supporters. In India, a term that's often used is well-wishers. You need well-wishers within the company who can be like roving ambassadors. And then finally, it needs to be systematized and linked with become synergistic to the company. And in the case of Microsoft, ultimately what Satya Nadella did was built on a lot of bottom-up approaches and top-down approaches, but got it to a point where Microsoft salespeople became incentivized to sell their own products as much as they were the startup solutions that came into the co-sell repository. And then which reflected a change in the strategy of the company to be more cloud-centric. So there is that process that needs to happen. So a start has to be made, but then that spark needs to become a bigger fire. And this is where then the top leadership becomes important. So that's one part of my answer. But the other part is now when you look at these multiple ecosystems, okay? So we talked about the why, we talked about the how. This takes us a little bit to the issue of where. And you mentioned some specific places like Israel, Bangalore, Hong Kong. Now, in fact, what's common to all of these is, especially Bangalore, Israel, Silicon Valley, Zhongguancun, these are all these are mature startup ecosystems. Okay, they may be. So that's what they have in common. What they may vary on is whether they're in advanced markets like Silicon Valley and Israel, or in emerging markets like Bangalore and Zhongguancun. And what I found is, what is great about these kind of locations is there's a critical mass of both the gorillas and the startups. So there's great possibilities to engage. But how you do it in an advanced market, how you do it in an emerging market, some adjustments have to be made in the latter, because in certain areas you find a lot of appetite for entrepreneurship, but the ecosystem is also, in relative terms, less mature. So, for example, in Silicon Valley and Israel, you find serial entrepreneurs, people who are on their third startup, fourth startup. In Bangalore, Zhongguancun, I've met many more first-time entrepreneurs. VCs are plenty, but again, in some new emergent areas, they also are figuring out the valuation, what really makes sense. So maybe, Tarun Khanna from Harvard has this term called institutional void, which emerging markets have more of. And so you have to maybe adapt a little bit more to make sure that you have a deeper understanding of what's going on, overcome some of the information gaps there are. And in fact, a few years ago, what I found in places like Bangalore and Zhongguancun, in contrast to Israel and Silicon Valley, where the multinationals would look at which startups were invested in by VCs. A few years ago, I used to see the VCs paying attention to which startups Microsoft was engaging with and so on, you know. So,
Okay.
but of course, now these ecosystems have also become fairly mature. My point is, first thing to realize is there's a difference with emerging markets. On the one hand, there's more appetite, and you can actually get access to some really novel things, like all these interesting payment solutions coming out of China and India. But on the other hand, you have to also accept that there's maybe a little bit more immaturity, maybe a little bit more hand-holding. Now, the other side of another perspective, though, is these are all clusters, innovation hotspots, but these are not the only places in the world, right? My hometown is called Vellore, which is well known in certain areas, like medical education and engineering education, but it's not it's off the beaten track. And so I've always had a special interest in places off the beaten track. And before I came to Shanghai, I was based in Ningbo, which has a strong entrepreneurial culture, but it's not a tech hub. Yet even in Ningbo, I saw IBM engaging with startups. Before I moved to China, my home base was Glasgow in Scotland. And Glasgow is great, but it's no Cambridge, it's no Silicon Valley. And even there, I saw Sun Microsystems engaging with startups. And what I find is in these non-hotspots, this is where government's intervention is particularly important. That's not to say that government isn't important in the hotspots like Israel or Zhongguancun, but the deal flow between corporates and startups is much higher for things to happen more naturally. But when you go off the beaten track, in fact, you need a third entity to be entrepreneurial too, not just the big companies and the startups, but policymakers. And so in Glasgow, for example, I came across a fascinating policy initiative. I mentioned how after the Second World War, lots of American companies came and set up manufacturing facilities, right? But over time, they found that they were losing a cost advantage. It made more sense to move these facilities to Eastern Europe at one time and then Asia. So those multinationals were also saying, we need to up our game and do more innovation, but they had a chicken and egg problem. Their headquarters would not give them the mandate unless they had the capabilities, but they couldn't build the capabilities unless they got a mandate from headquarters. So some very entrepreneurial subsidiary managers were interested to work with local startups on some pilot projects that could demonstrate to headquarters that they were capable of doing more. And seeing this, the local policymakers put in place a policy initiative called Scottish Technology and Collaboration Stack, a very explicit policy initiative that, and I would say Scottish Enterprise, the policy body, was being entrepreneurial too. Then in Ningbo, how IBM ended up working with startups is the Smart City office of Ningbo very cleverly used a very generic policy tool. So this is different from Scotland. They didn't have an explicit custom-made policy. They just took an existing generic one. As you know, all cities in China have smart city. But instead of having thousands and thousands of projects, they took the entire smart city pie, broke it into a small number of big chunks, like smart logistics, because it's a port city, smart education, smart transport, and gave each piece of the big pie to one company. So the deal size was big enough for big companies to be interested. IBM got the first one, which was smart logistics. But the other part of the cunning plan was the local government officials knew that no one company can deliver the whole project. They would have to work with local implementation partners. And who were they? In the case of Ningbo, it was local entrepreneurial firms. And so I guess for me, when you go beyond these established clusters, the role of entrepreneurial policymakers becomes all the more important to help with the matchmaking process, to make it possible, because actually these players either are not around or they don't have enough critical mass to get going. But if they can be a catalyst, then even in these places off the beaten track, I've seen it is possible.
Fantastic. So I think, quite a detailed and well described thing, how the industry, the entrepreneurs, the government, the policymakers play the role. I noticed one important thing, which is quite important as well, which you described and use the word many times in your description, is the maturity, the mature ecosystem. So I was wondering that, life, life organisms, we say the human species or even the species around us are very mature. We say, and we measure the index of maturity because they take birth, live for a particular life, and then they die, and then again the recycling happens, right? So how should I measure the maturity of an ecosystem of a particular place? Like something comes to my mind is that, is the infant mortality has to be certain index or certain longevity? Because if too many people are dying just taking the birth, then maybe that ecosystem is not mature. So that is something which I wanted to understand, that how do these things become mature? One is, so what is the parameter of that maturity?
Oh, that's a very good question. And there are people who study, economic geographers and so on, who have a much more specialist in-depth knowledge of this than I do. My knowledge is more secondhand. But I think some of the things that you've said is actually very pertinent. And this has to do with, I think, the replenishment, the likelihood of having new companies come into play, which means
Right.
I think where there is the access to resources, where there is the ability to keep creating these new ventures, which also means, and resources, I think you can think at multiple levels. It's sort of the input factors. Do we have talent? Do we have money? Then also to some extent, what are the demand conditions that they have access to? It could either be because they are within a large domestic market, or they are part of an industry that has a global reputation. So even if it's not a domestic market-drawn demand, that you will still have access to demand overseas, which was the case in your industry in Bangalore. For example, when I was doing my doctoral research, there wasn't much domestic demand per se, but Bangalore was acquiring a name. And so they were, I remember one entrepreneur telling me, if I say I'm from Bangalore to a US prospect, half the battle is done, and then there's also the supporting industries that develop to support entrepreneurs, and that includes the academic infrastructure and the possibilities to do research. So that's one way to look at it, and these resource conditions, and of course what goes along with this, of course, very often is stiff competition. But this is what helps these companies to get better and better. So there is more resources on offer, but there's also much stiffer competition for it. So that's at one level.
Right.
But at another level, and this is what people like Anna-Lee Saxenian from Berkeley highlighted in her study on Silicon Valley, there's also a cultural dimension. To what extent do people feel willing to take a risk, and what is the attitude to failure? This is something I've heard many people say about Silicon Valley, that failure is worn like a badge of honor. And I've seen this in Israel as well. So, and also it's about the networks, how supportive are the networks, because there's competition, but is there also recognition that you need collaboration as well? And so these are sort of the softer aspects, I think, of maturity. So it's both, so you can measure, I think, the resources, how much venture capital is available, what is the birth rate of these firms, and so on. And finally, you have to also see, I think you made a very astute observation that clusters also can rise and fall, right? And what people have been amazed about Silicon Valley is that they have sustained their innovative output for a long time, but even in the last 12 months, you've seen so many companies moving their headquarters from Silicon Valley to Texas, to Austin, for example, because as competition rises for these resources, then the prices as well rise. There's an affordability issue. And so that's the opportunity for new clusters to also emerge. I don't think Silicon Valley is done. But they're also having
Right.
questions they have to ask themselves to make sure that they continue to replenish. And just one quick thing, I just met a student of mine who used to work for LinkedIn in San Francisco, and he's just started his internship in Tencent in Shenzhen. And he's saying it's been, he's originally Chinese, but he's saying he's getting a culture shock because he thought they moved fast in Silicon Valley. But he said, what would have taken me 4 weeks to do in Silicon Valley, my boss is expecting me to do in 2. So
no, I think that's my next question. I noted down there to ask that how do you rate the China's startup ecosystem as compared to, let's say, US? There are a lot of debates, a lot of things, but maybe your couple of points on that.
Yeah. So first of all, I think in a very short period of time, in front of our eyes, you and I are privileged to be here on the ground, and we have seen how rapidly things have developed. By the way, in India also, there's been fantastic developments. And I think in the last 12 months, seeing some of these SaaS startups go public, you can see there's a coming of age happening in India as well. But I think China and the US are similar in the sense that their domestic markets are so big, which is why these two countries together account for the vast majority of unicorns. But one of the things that seems to be a little bit what you see even more of, what is like even more turbocharged in China, is the level of competition. And I see this both inter-organizational and intra-organizational. So what seems to happen, I feel a little bit more here, is when there's a hot area, there seem to be many, many, many more bets taken than in other more long-standing ecosystems like the US. Like even when the sharing bikes came out, I couldn't believe how the 13th and the 14th project were also getting funding. But there seems to be a slightly different approach here, where many, many more bets are taken. So a lot of people lose in the end. But as an industry, enough happens so that somebody wins and wins big, and then there's rapid progress. And to some extent, I think we are seeing this in AI and even semiconductors. So you could argue that the efficiency of the utilization of capital may be a little bit lower. But I think there's also a view beyond firm level success here. And there is, particularly, I think, because the government plays a big role, there's also a lot of attention to, but how do we do as an industry, as an industry from China? And so it seems to be that there, the system, either formally or informally, maybe a combination of the two, is geared towards making sure that there is collective success for sure. And so that's, but that makes the competition enormous. And you see more things. And the other thing is, in fact, I was reminded by when I met the student of mine, because apart from the speed factor, he said the other thing is it's very competitive. And so it seems as if, especially the larger tech companies in China, encourage much more competition among the teams. Multiple teams can be working on the same thing. And I think that's also a slightly different aspect of the culture. And what all of this is to say ultimately is that things are moving at a very rapid rate. In the end, as users, we see more and more innovations come up. But for people who are in the game, it's fairly brutal.
Right. So we have another last 10 minutes left so that, we can let you go for your next, teaching class. So I was just wanted to ask that, in the context of India, we are currently nearly $3 trillion economy. And when our Tech Mahindra CEO was here a couple of years ago, even Prime Minister Modi also said that we want to be 5 trillion. And then the things came, okay, you can be there if you can create, 15 million jobs per year, or now government cannot do that. Maybe they can enable things. You rightly mentioned that the maturity of ecosystem can be either to access to resources, the demand, the talent, the money, but everything cannot be done by just the government. So the key thing which comes is that if you really want to create those unicorns, those unicorns has to be created in a market like India. And we have seen that some companies like Cred or Farm Easy and all these companies are coming up. But then if you look at the state-owned companies, mostly the state-owned companies which are there in China or even in India, the innovation quotient is not that much. So what difference do you see between the state-owned companies and the private sector? Is it the trust? Is it the internal persuasion is too high in the state-owned companies? Or maybe even sometimes the laggards private company may also be suffering from the same thing. So just wanted your views on state-owned companies versus the private companies, because in India, state-owned companies are still very big actually, and a lot of people are employed there. So if they are not supported, if they're not supported well, if they do not really innovate, then also the probability of India becoming a 5 trillion or 6 trillion economy may not be so high.
I can't claim to have done a lot of formal research on state-owned enterprises, but I think what we generally know about state-owned versus private enterprises in general is the level of incentive and level of risk-taking is definitely higher in private companies. And also, I mean, even here in China, during this period, around 2012 to 2016, where there was this large number of Chinese companies trying to go global, and many of them were making acquisitions of these medium-sized German companies with a lot of strong technology, mainly in industrial goods and so on. A lot of private companies were the ones that were going forward and trying to make a difference. So I think, first of all, there's just a very different level of incentive, and also the cultures are very different. And I think state-owned enterprises will not change overnight. I think they operate in a certain way, and their DNA is of a certain type. And so I think actually private companies have a very important role. In India, the private sector bodies like NASSCOM have also been very instrumental. I mean, I thought their 10,000, 10K warehouse idea to try to incubate startups and so on was an important step forward and so on. So, I mean, I suppose to start with, one needs to be a little bit realistic of what state-owned enterprises can do. And so if we want to see more unicorns, I think coming out of India, I do think that private sector trade bodies need to play an important role. And you can also see that successful SaaS founders, also there's very much a strong sense of giving back to the community and trying to invest in new startups and so on. And so I would say maybe that would be the more realistic way forward. But I just want to add one more thing, because you were mentioning employment. I think the mainstay of employment creation in many economies in the world is neither the very large corporations, be they state-owned or private, nor are they startups per se. It's really these small and medium-sized enterprises that have been around for a while. They're not startups. They're not big companies, but they are in many cases moderately successful companies, but they're profitable and they generate employment. At least that's what you see in a lot of Western economies. And I think, and these are the least glamorous of the companies, right? Even in business schools, we talk about either the gorillas or the startups. But there are these small and medium-sized companies that have been around for a while. Some of them are family-owned, but and that to me is actually where the private sector has a very important role in helping in generating employment. And I think from a policy point of view, anything that can be done to help these small and medium-sized enterprises, because they neither have access to all these VC funds who are now becoming more and more active in China and India, nor do they easily get bank loans and so on in the way that a big company can do with their collateral. And these humble SMEs, I think actually they play an important role in generating employment. So I guess I have two different answers. I think on the one hand, state-owned enterprises, we shouldn't expect things that they cannot do. But also that from a more macroeconomic employment generation perspective, it may in fact be neither of the two sets of companies I talk about in my book, neither the very young startups nor the large multinationals. Maybe it's these more humble SMEs. The founders will never make it to the cover of Forbes magazine, but many of them actually play a very important role in society.
Well, that's a very, 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 important point you made, that employment, which is a key, for any economy's growth. People are employed, but then, of course, I don't have the data, but I totally agree with you that maybe neither the private companies, neither the governments may be employing, because if I just look at a sample size of 3,000 to 4,000 Indians who are staying in Shanghai, and because I know a lot of people and I have certain idea of staying here for a decade, I think almost 75% people are employed in their own medium, small entrepreneur setups. And only 20-25% are actually in the big private companies or state companies, probably. So which means a sample size also, probably people need that, ecosystem. So I think I feel this maturity of the startup ecosystem, which probably Microsoft figured out how to create, and people are figuring out. I think I like. I really big takeaway is that how do you create a platform for access to resources? Even if you want the medium small entrepreneurs to grow and thrive and create more employment, that is key. Then the second thing was very important is the platform for demand. Whether it is local demand, I think you made a point that US and China, why they are thriving startup ecosystems, because they have high demand locally. Now that comes through the government or through the different channels, trade bodies, could be anything. And then the talent, of course, though, are you creating their talent? And that's where the academics and the institutes will play an important role. And of course, finally, on which that the thing which works is the money, right? Ultimately, money is the blood of that life organism, which really flows. So I think really, fantastic discussion, Dr. Shameen. I know I don't like stopping the discussion in between, but we have hardly 6 minutes left for 1:30 p.m. in China. Maybe just final of your comments. I think we need to have a follow-up discussion for sure. This has been a very accelerated discussion, but any final two comments on, the crisis of sustainability? I know it was in my plan to talk about SDGs. I can see a great, wonderful background as well. Maybe a few of your observations on that, and then we close the discussion.
Sure. Yes, I'm glad you pointed to this picture of the Sustainable Development Goals. And even as MBA director, I'm trying to encourage my students to think about these 17 goals that the United Nations adopted in September 2015 to be achieved by 2030. Right. And the great thing about these is it's not rocket science. These are things that I think everybody recognizes are important. SDG 1 is no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 3, good health, SDG 4, quality education. I mean, these are things that we are all sort of interested in. And basically, the genius of the SDGs is to articulate it as a package that the world has a consensus on. I do think that business has an important role to play, because with the adoption of this by the United Nations, there's a lot of emphasis on what governments can do, what civil society like charities and NGOs can do, and these are two very, very important pieces of the puzzle. But without business, this ain't going to happen. And the way Jeffrey Sachs puts it, he says this is the biggest business opportunity of the century. So I think trying to address some of these problems result in opportunities for business to address. So you can attempt to do good and do well. It's not straightforward, but it is an important challenge to take on. And in this process, I think you need both the scale of the big companies and the agility of the smaller companies. And so some of these principles that I've tried to articulate in the book, I believe have relevance to addressing some of these SDGs. And the 17th of the Sustainable Development Goals is called Partnerships for the Goals. And while it's important to think about intergovernmental partnerships, it's important to think of business and government. I think even within business, to think about tapping the complementary capabilities of startups and large corporations is important. And in this context, in a more inclusive way, NGOs may have a role to play, corporate foundations
Right.
may have a role to play. So that is what I hope going forward will increasingly happen. Climate change, for example, I think we're only going to make progress if we have more innovation, and startups and big companies coming together, pooling their resources, I think is very important. The final thing I would say is what I have observed in all this work is that even if you're not interested in startups, even if you're not interested in corporations, at a sort of the abstract level, what we can generalize from what I've been observing about the why, the how, and the where of corporate startup partnering is that there are three mindsets that are important. The why speaks to the entrepreneurial mindset. The how speaks to a collaborative mindset. And the where speaks to a global mindset. And even in this period where there's pushback against globalization, I think we also still need a global mindset, which says we take good ideas from wherever they come, and we look beyond our noses to also be concerned about things that matter elsewhere. And we're also all interdependent. You know, that's what the pandemic has shown us, both from a health point of view, a supply chain point of view. Climate change is reminding us about this. And so being entrepreneurial, collaborative, and global in our approach. Even as we work in our own respective local contexts, I think these are three mindsets that I hope people will take away. This is certainly something I hope as an educator I'm able to inculcate in my students. But in fact, you, Mukesh, exemplify all these mindsets extremely well as you work, heading a multinational in China. And that would be my final thought.
Fantastic. So, Dr. Shameen, just rapid fire 5 questions. You have to just answer in one word or what is there. That is the closure of the for the talk today. Which just no description, just answer that. Which country will still win the startup ecosystem race, US or China?
Both.
That's diplomatic answer. Okay. You just answer in yes or no. Can India at some stage in next 5 years come closer to China in the startup ecosystem? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Which company apart from Microsoft do you see next 5 years will get your attention to create and contribute to the startup ecosystem?
Unilever.
Fantastic. Who is your favorite author?
Enid Blyton.
Oh,
does that name? Do you remember?
I remember actually. That's one of the probably the strangest choice I would hear actually. And feels nostalgic. Okay, great. And the final question: what is your resolution for the year 2022?
Stay positive.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shameen, for sharing your wonderful an hour with us. It was a fantastic discussion. I'm sure when we look back on the recordings and on the what has gone to the social media, it will be great to see and hear it again. Thank you so much. I know you have another assignment. I'll not take you hold for a long time, but thanks a lot for coming on to Youtalks. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you, Mukesh.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.